Welcome, listeners, to a realm where shadows dance and whispers echo. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this is Quills and Chills, the podcast that brings you face to face with the masterminds behind the macabre. In each episode, we journey into the minds of horror writers and filmmakers to uncover the secrets lurking within their tales of terror. From classic tales to modern nightmares, we'll traverse the corridors of the human psyche and unravel the threads of dread that keep us turning the pages or sitting out there in the dark. Welcome to Quills and Chills. Hello, and welcome back to Quills and Chills. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and today I am talking with Eric LaRocca, Bram Stoker Award finalist, Splatterpunk Award winner, and one of the most distinctive voices in modern horror. Named by Esquire as a writer shaping the genre's next golden age, Eric is here to talk with me today about his latest novel, and boy, is it a piece of work, at Dark I Become Loathsome. So welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you and talk about the book and all things horror. So thank you for having me.
Sweet. I appreciate your time. I always like to start out getting to know you a little bit. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I live in Boston. I went to grad school here like 4 or 5 years ago. I went to Emerson and fell in love with the city and met my partner here, and we moved in together shortly after I graduated, and we just love living in Boston. It's a beautiful, really culturally rich city. I feel like a lot of history. And I'm a New England boy at heart. Like I grew up in Connecticut, a really small town in the northwest corner of Connecticut in a small town called Kent. So I'm very much like at home in New England. I've always really enjoyed living here. It has that like spooky sort of like otherworldly feel, especially in the autumn. It's obviously Stephen King has made quite a bit of money like marketing New England as a spooky place to visit. But it's true, like there's so much to be said for the quaint charm and but also like the kind of the weird, unsettling vibes of New England, which I just like love. I've always loved. And one of our favorite things to do is go and visit Salem, which is like half an hour away from where we live. Salem's a great place to visit. But yeah, I've always been attracted to like the darkness, the macabre, and horror in general has always been a really wonderful thing in my life, more specifically like horror fiction, horror film. I grew up, like I said, in that small rural town and was very isolated from a very young age. Growing up as a queer kid, I didn't like have many friends. I was kind of just like left to my own devices. And from there, I kind of just developed this infatuation with reading horror fiction. And my parents saw this from an early age and they really wanted to like encourage me. They were so supportive and really encouraged me to watch like all of the classic horror monster movies from like the 30s and 40s, like Dracula and Frankenstein and The Mummy with like Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. So I kind of like my journey with horror really started with that. And from there, I just went to total opposite extreme with like splatterpunk and extreme horror, and it really was like Clive Barker that completely opened my mind when
Right.
I yeah, when I discovered him, like when I was a late teenage years, like going into college, I found Clive Barker. And not like I discovered him, but like he was already pretty well established, but like
You found each other.
yeah, we found each other, and he was such a profound influence on my writing and just my being. Because prior to encountering him, I really didn't see a lot of like openly queer creators operating in horror, and then especially writing queer characters. So for me, it was a really special find to encounter Clive and delve into his work, and that was like a gateway that led to other authors in the similar space. So like Dennis Cooper is a big one for me, Poppy Z. Bright, Kathy Koja, just like so many amazing authors from that era. And it really was Clive Barker that kind of started me on that path toward discovery of just like who writes really disturbing, fucked up like queer material. And yeah, so I've always been a student of the genre and really just invested in transgressive fiction. It really was like when I matured, when I, was like in late high school, like early college student, then I was like, all right, I really want to write like really dark, unsettling, transgressive fiction and, kind of mirror my efforts after these writers that I really just absolutely adore. So Clive Barker was on that list, Poppy Z. Bright was on that list, and yeah, it's wonderful now. I feel like we're in such a golden era of horror fiction, especially with like queer creators writing. Um,
1000%. There's so much great stuff coming up and coming out, pun intended,
yeah,
still.
yeah, yeah. So I'm just like really excited about the future, and I feel like horror has had booms throughout like the decades that have led up to this one, but I feel like this one is especially powerful, like this kind of era that we're living in. And I'm just like really honored and excited to be writing this kind of fiction during it.
I've got to say, I mean, and what you did with this story, which we'll get into in just a minute, well, I'll get into it in a second. I have one more question. I actually want to kind of know what your process is for writing. Are you somebody that sort of dives in with both feet, or do you obsessively plan, or you're somewhere in the middle with all of that? It always interests me to know how people plan to write, or does it just flow?
Yeah, I used to be someone who didn't plan anything, and this was primarily how I was before I went to grad school, and then grad school kind of drilled it into me like we're going to make you outline. And it was at that point that I was like, you know what? I actually do like outlining, and I like having things prepared. I like kind of knowing where the story is going to progress, how my characters are going to interact with one another. I mean, prior to that, I kind of just created on whims and like what I felt like creating. And that's not to say that I don't leave the opportunity open for like organic development. If something arises while I'm writing and I'm like, you know what, I really want to go in this direction, I'm totally agreeable to something like that. I think it's important for writers to have that flexibility, and we have to follow our muse, most importantly of all. Like we have to create what is in our heart, but also, follow our true path. And if our path starts out as one thing and, we think we're going to write like this kind of story, and then the story kind of mutates and develops and then it just becomes something else. But I mean, we have to like honor that. I feel like it's our duty to really honor what the story wants to be more than anything. So I'm definitely, I guess I'm somewhere kind of in the middle. Like I do like to plan quite a bit what I write. And I make pretty extensive notes like on character and plot summary, those kind of descriptions. But all that to say, like, I really do love those moments when I'm surprised and when I'm like, wow, I didn't think I was going to go off on this tangent, or I didn't think I was going to go off on this path, but I kind of like where this is going and this is shocking to me. And if it's shocking to me, I feel like it's going to be shocking to a reader. So I feel like that's really important to kind of remember that when you're creating. And that's definitely how I operate.
I totally agree. I write mostly in film format, and I think I was always drawn to screenplay format just because of the structure, and it is such a rigid structure. But I remember I had a creative writing teacher really encourage me to embrace freeform writing, which was the hardest thing in the world for me to do in the beginning. But once you just let go and let those floodgates open, I was just blown away by the stuff that just comes naturally or unnaturally, I guess, if you will, but ever how that goes. But still, I'm kind of like you very much in that way. Like I kind of split down the middle. I like the structure, but I also want to be open to just letting it organically develop. So
Yeah, and it depends on the project too. Like, if there are some projects that are a little bit more rigid that I find where it's like I have to follow this formula or I have to follow this outline that I've set up, and like maybe there will be some risks that I take and some changes or developments, but then there's other projects where I'm writing and it's just like vibes only. And if it's like I'm vibing with like how this character is interacting in this scene and then they go off and do this other thing that surprises me, it's like I'm just going to go along for the ride and see what happens.
yeah, no, it's fun. All right, we have to talk about this book. I'm dying to talk about this book. So
Yes.
I, as anybody that's watched the show knows, I do this thing where I will not read the things that the publicists send us, the one sheets with the story set up. I don't read, the back covers or any of that stuff. I want to go into the story completely unaware and not knowing what to expect. And boy, every single time I turn the page in this story, I'm like, okay. First of all, your main character scared the crap out of me in your first chapter. I was like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. So I absolutely loved it. I think it is unique. It is definitely not something I've seen before, having read quite a few books and seen quite a few movies in my life. It's definitely a unique tale. So I'm going to start with that sort of the very first obvious question. Tell us a little bit about what the book itself is about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate that. I'm glad the book, worked for you and that you really enjoyed it. The book is essentially about A Dark I Become Loathsome is about a man who undergoes a significant amount of loss and trauma in a very short period of time. And in order to cope with this loss and this suffering, he sets up this really strange ritual that allows people to have this transformative, almost like reincarnation, rebirth process throughout the ritual. And he does this by burying them alive for 30 minutes. And after digging them up, he hopes that they will have like a new lease on life. These are people that he kind of trolls the dark web and like the forums on like Reddit and Tumblr to kind of interact with, and people who are similarly afflicted the way he is, who are dealing with like a lot of loss and who are contemplating suicide, and he really wants to help them have a new outlook on life more than anything. And the book really revs into high gear when he encounters one client in particular who kind of threatens to upend all of the things he knew about his ritual, about his life, about what happened to his son who disappeared several years ago. And the book is a meditation on like grief and loneliness and identity and all of these really unpleasant topics. And that's kind of like the long-winded elevator pitch for the book.
I think it's exactly that, and it is a sort of a beautiful sort of meditation at that. I don't know why I'm so drawn to stories about grief and the impact that that can have on someone's life, but it definitely is that. Before I would dive in, I want to talk about the main character Ashley and all that. But before I do, I want to talk about the title. I found the title extremely intriguing, and I love how you use it throughout the story itself. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the significance of this title and sort of like how you came to this title and a little more about that.
Yeah, definitely. Titles are really important to me. I love a really Baroque, poetic sort of title. And this book really kind of like locked in to gear for me once I had this title. I had had the concept for this book prior to having the title. I knew what I wanted to write about. I knew Ashley's character pretty intimately. I knew how I wanted the story to progress. I knew I wanted certain reveals to happen throughout. I knew I wanted to nest other stories inside the larger narrative, and I knew what those stories were going to be, but I didn't have the title. And it really wasn't until I I think I was just doing something really innocuous, like I was just like doing the laundry or doing the dishes, and I was thinking about like darkness and how we sort of like mutate under like at nighttime, and how nighttime is an especially really awful time for people who are like marginalized and more, more vulnerable to sort of like violence and whatnot. And I just thought of the phrase "at dark I become loathsome," and it was really at that moment that everything sort of clicked in for me, and I was like, "Wow, that could be like a really compelling mantra that Ashley repeats throughout the course of the narrative, and kind of centers everything, but also destabilizes the story in a way. I was also really thinking of Ian Reid's I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which is a brilliant book. And I know that that is like repeated throughout the book as well, that phrase. So yeah, no, titles, like I said, are very important to me. And it really was like cluing in on Ashley's character more with this title that I was like, all right, I now understand what the book is really going to be about. And I think titles have that ability to really do that. I don't love like just simple one word titles. They can be like evocative and they can be like iconic, but I love a title that tells a story. And I know that they're maybe a little bit more difficult to remember for some people, but within the context of the book, I feel like the title really suits this book, and I feel like it draws you in a way. Like I feel like it compels you to pick the book up off the shelf and be like, what the hell is this? Like, what am I getting into? Like, I want to know, why do you become loathsome at dark?
Exactly. And the way you use it, the way you weave it through the story, as you mentioned, it comes up quite a bit throughout the story, and I found it to be, it's as you said, it's a very grounding effect. It's like, okay, like as things progress within the story, it's like, okay, we're resetting here, like we're grounding
Mhm.
ourselves again, because this is who we are
Yes.
as the story goes. And I thought it was great, so it was
Thank
not lost
you.
on me, I would tell you that. So
Thank you.
so let's talk about Ashley a little bit. So as you mentioned, Ashley, your main character, he has endured some pretty profound losses. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what those are, but also more about crafting this character and sort of like delving into his psyche and telling his story of his journey through grief and the impact that it's had on his life.
Yeah, so actually, before the narrative even really begins, he has suffered the loss of his wife, Pema, to cancer. Cancer plays a very significant role in this book. And actually, like in a lot of my other work, a lot of my short story collections deal with cancer in some way or another. And, so he's dealt with that loss. And then a while after Pema's passing, his son vanished while outside a supermarket while Ashley had gone inside to, I forget, like collect his money from the
Credit card,
register.
credit
Yeah,
card, I
credit
think it
card.
was.
Yeah, yeah. So he's dealing with both of those losses, those really tragic misfortunes so close to one another. And I'm someone who, unfortunately, I definitely imagine what life is going to be like when I lose the people most important in my life. I have two very loving parents. They're both very healthy, they're both happy, and I love them very much, but I dread the day that I'm going to lose them. And I have a very loving partner. We've been together for like 5 years now, and I also dread the day when I lose him and he's not there anymore. And it's very frightening. And I know that we're supposed to, as writers, we're supposed to kind of like poke the wound that really harms us and kind of stir around in there and see what else we find and what else we can drag out to like bring to our art. And I definitely don't recommend writers write from their suffering entirely, because I feel like that's not good for mental health in general. But if you're comfortable writing from the wellspring of this sort of anxiety or misfortune, I felt comfortable writing from it at this time. And some of my future books that I have scheduled to be published deal with grief as well. Grief to me is just a very universal emotion. It feels like an equalizer in a lot of ways. And I really have a lot of anxiety for the day that I find that, my parents are no longer there or my partner's no longer there. And I think this stems from, I lost someone very special to me at a really early age. I had a very meaningful connection with a mentor who was an actress and lived in the small town that I grew up in Kent. And she was so special to me, so such a brilliant mentor, such a loving friend, and kind of showed me what my life could be like if I stayed dedicated to writing and my craft, and what what my life could be like, essentially, if I just stayed militant and really dedicated myself to my art. And unfortunately, she passed away from breast cancer when I was like 13 or 14, and it was it was such a devastating blow and really hard to watch that person that I just completely adored change and, you know, become weaker. And I kind of watched it like happen in real time, which was really unsettling for like a teenage boy to like experience that. And I think that's also why cancer plays such a significant role in a lot of my stories, because it was something that was introduced to me at such a young age, the possibility of like, this happens to people, this is an inevitability for a lot of us. And it's something that makes people profoundly uncomfortable, and I agree, it is very uncomfortable, but I've always liked writing about things that cause discomfort, and I don't necessarily view my fiction as like horrifying or scary. I don't set out to be scary when I write. I am more interested in being like unsettling and like ruining your day more than anything. I'm really interested in like those kinds of films or books that you close or you finish watching and you're like, you can't think about anything else because it
Yeah.
was so
You need a
upsetting.
minute. Yeah. You
You
need
know,
a
it
minute. Yep.
yeah, it just, like, ruins your day completely, and I don't wanna cause harm with my fiction, but I certainly want to affect people, and I want to cause them, like, this intense visceral reaction to it. So that's essentially where the whole, like, genesis of Ashley's character and, like, how he poorly grapples with this loss and, like, my motivation for writing it.
Well, I will say mission accomplished because when I finished the story, I did need to take a minute, because there's a lot happening. And one of the things which you touched on earlier is this ritual that Ashley engages in. And as much as we can without spoilers or anything like that, I'd love to talk a little bit more about that ritual. And I got to ask the question, how the hell did you come up with that?
Actually, you might be surprised to know, like, this kind of ritual has existed in other cultures. And
Wow.
I actually came across an article on Vice or ID like many, many years ago. And it was about an organization in, I wanna say, I think it was in Thailand that did these sort of, like, not exactly like what's in the book, but some sort of, like, ritual that hopefully would, like, inspire people to have a more positive outlook on life. And it was, like, this sort of, like, death-inspired ritual, and that's really where the genesis of the ritual came from. I've always been really fascinated with other cultures and like subcultures and threading like history into narratives, because so often like fact is so much stranger than fiction. Like what exists in our world is so frightening and so unsettling that I just find it really really interesting to write about those things. And so I can't necessarily take credit for the entire ritual like in its originality, but it definitely was something that I read in this article, and I was like, this would be such a really fascinating backdrop for a character to show him like in the grieving process how he operates and how he comes to term with all of these losses in such a short period of time.
I will say it was an I don't have a fear of that per se, but it was a new fear unlocked for me. And I will say you preyed upon that masterfully in this
Thank
story.
you.
Uh, I want to talk about some of the themes a little bit too. Obviously, I don't think we need to get too heavy with it, but you do touch on quite a few themes from, you know, I don't know how much I can say for YouTube and all of that, but the unaliving ideation, we'll say that gender identity as well is something that you tackle, and I thought you did it really great in this story, and some of the struggles that Ashley has had, and especially with fatherhood and his relationship with Bailey, his son. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of weaving all of those elements together within the story and sort of talking about them and being both authentic and respectful at the same time without feeling gratuitous.
Yeah, I mean, the themes that you mentioned are definitely at the forefront of my mind, maybe like consciously or subconsciously. Like I knew that the book was talking about fatherhood in some way, but I don't think I realized like how overt it was. Maybe even until you brought it up just now, but it really does like touch on that quite a bit. Like, is Ashley a good father? Like, what does it mean to be a good father? There's also like the question of like identity and like repressing your sexuality. I mean, that's really what like the crux of the book is centered upon. It's centered upon grief and loss and trauma, but it's also really centered on the devastation that occurs when we don't honor our true selves and when we don't put ourselves forward as who we truly are. I mean, Ashley is living a lie essentially. He knows that he prefers men to women. His attraction lies more with men. That said, he questions himself constantly and he constantly represses himself and doesn't want to engage. And the book also really tackles like intrusive thoughts and the the harm that occurs when we put these intrusive thoughts to action. You know, I'm someone that has definitely suffered from intrusive thoughts and obsessive compulsive disorder. I struggle with that still on a daily basis, but a lot of the book really revolves around like showing the normalcy of them, but also like what can happen and the horror and the harm that can come from like acting upon these thoughts. That said, I try not to judge my characters when I'm writing. I really try to have a level of empathy for them. And I hope that shows in the writing. I really don't want to come at it like I'm some sort of like final boss or like judge for them. I want the reader to have their own interpretation of the character, and I don't want to sway them in any way for how they feel. And however they feel, however they react to Ashley and the other characters, that's totally on them and that's their. But I never want to be prescriptive and write something that makes people think a certain way. I'm really more interested in like open-ended conversations when I write. And I often get like a little uncomfortable when someone asks me, well, what did you definitively mean by this? I'm more interested in like your interpretation. I'm more interested in having that conversation and seeing, you know, what did you think? I know what I thought when I was writing it, but sometimes people can unlock things in your book that you really didn't even think about. And sometimes the thing that they come up with is like far more interesting than what you had originally intended.
Right. And I would say with Ashley, for me, I felt a lot of empathy and compassion for him and what he had gone through in terms of leading him up to each of these moments. And then there were other characters, and we're going to leave it at that. I won't say who, where I was like, yeah, you're going to get what you deserve. But but that said, that brings me to my next question. What are you hoping that people take away from this story? What do you, I know you actually, I think you just touched on it a little bit, but so what do you hope that at the end of the day, after readers put this book down, they're going to walk away feeling or thinking or maybe not even knowing?
That's a great question. I don't think too much about the audience when I'm writing, but if I had to say something of like what I hope people leave this story with. I hope that this story inspires people to be freer and to be unapologetically who they are. I spent so much of my youth like not being who I was and really like hiding a lot of the time and trying to like assimilate and not and just fit in and blend in. And it was a detriment to my self-esteem and my power as a queer person. I feel like we as queer people are inherently resilient and powerful and wonderful. So to not honor that is a real tragedy, I feel. So I really hope people come away from this book just wanting more to express themselves, however that may be, whether it be like the clothing that you wear, the art that you create, whatever. I just want people to be freer. And it's interesting, transgressive fiction is really difficult sometimes. Actually, most of the time it's very difficult. But there's an author that I really enjoy, Samuel R. Delany, and he wrote this book called Hog, which is this really like graphic, very violent, hypersexual book. But he said in an interview about transgressive fiction how transgressive fiction sort of like forces people to confront certain things and move the line of respectability and what is considered like normal. And I kind of agree with that. Transgressive fiction really does like push people to their extreme and push people past a certain threshold. And I think I really want to inspire people to like go outside of their comfort zone too. Like I want people to like go beyond what they think they can handle and then go a little bit further. So those are like the two main things I think about when I think of like people interacting with this book in particular.
That's very interesting because I would say I would say with Ashley, there was every opportunity in the writing of it for me anyway to, with all of the loss and everything that he experienced, to regress in even in sort of his physical appearance and how he changes throughout the story could be viewed as regressing, but actually it was him sort of, as you said, sort of transgressing or progressing in a way, and moving to where he ended up at the end of the story. And I found it, like I said, I found him to be a very empathetic and compassionate character that I was kind of rooting for in the end. So it was very, I'm gonna leave it at that. I don't want to give spoilers, but
Thank you so much.
all right, my last favorite question. In your opinion, what do you think that readers should look forward to? What's the most favorite penultimate moment in all of the story that readers should look forward to? And before you answer that, I'm going to say I have kind of two. I would say I got to choose my words carefully here. Ashley's escalation or his arc, I guess, through the story, like I said, was preying on a lot of fears that you unlocked in the first chapter. But that said, probably my absolute favorite is the big twist at the end. And I'm just going to leave it there because obviously we're not going to give any spoilers away, but that's probably my favorite point. And because didn't see it coming. Not gonna
Thank
lie, did
you.
not see it coming.
Thank you.
So
That means a lot. I mean, the twist is a big moment in the book. So I would definitely say the twist is a favorite of mine. I also really hope readers appreciate the nested stories within the
I was about to
narrative.
say that the sub stories that you had, those were great
Yeah,
too. So
those are special to me. They were always going to be threaded into this book. They were always a part of this book, written specifically to like complement Ashley's descent, psychological disintegration. And I really, I don't know, those stories like they really are special to me. And if anything, like I've honestly thought about like expanding upon them in other works and kind of like doing what Stephen King does where he'll like introduce a character in one book and then it'll pop up
pop up
in like a
somewhere else.
different narrative like further down the line. So I could definitely see some of the characters in those nested stories like showing up in other versions of my work, like, you know, 5, 10 years down the road. But yeah, I would say the twist is the big one. And then like the nested narratives like that are threaded throughout, I think are really meaningful. At least I hope they are for readers.
I love them. I did want to mention that, and I'm glad you brought it up because I was just going to say the little sub stories, the nested stories they just said were, I don't want to say fun diversion, but it was interesting because it's like I'm all into this story, and now suddenly you've got me into this other story, and
Hmm.
I'm like hooked on that page. I could stop, and it was a fun stop along the way. We'll put it that way.
Thank
So.
you.
Well, the book, as I said, is called At Dark I Become Loathsome. It is actually available everywhere as of January 28th. Is that correct? So it's everywhere
Yes.
now.
Yep.
And as we always like to say here at Quills and Chills, please support your local bookstores whenever possible. So, Eric, how can our audiences find you online or on social?
Yeah, so I'm pretty much on all of the big platforms. I'm still on Twitter, X, at Eric_LaRocca. I'm on Bluesky, just at ericlarocca.bsky.social. I'm on Instagram at Eric_LaRocca. So folks can connect with me on any of those sites. And then there's obviously my main website, which is just ericlarocca.com.
I'll add all of those to the show notes. For the video version, I'll also put them on screen as well. So we'll have all of that. So again, I appreciate your time. I absolutely love this story. You're now in my top shelf of my bookcase. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much for having me. It means a lot. I appreciate it.
All right, guys, we'll see you next time on Quills and Chills. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Quills and Chills. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mysterious and the haunted. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to support us by subscribing on your preferred podcast platform and leaving us a rating or review, because your feedback helps keep those chills running down both our spines. And feel free to share the show with your favorite fellow horror enthusiasts. Also, if you guys have any spooky stories, strange encounters, or paranormal experiences of your own, I'd love to hear them. Reach out to me on social media or email me at quillsandchillspodcast@gmail.com. Who knows? Your story might end up on a very special episode. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, y'all.